The Brown Pundits Browncast.
Hello and welcome to another episode of the Brown Pundits Browncast. This is the 11th episode in our series of podcasts on the history of the Indian subcontinent. My name is Maneesh and in today's episode we'll cover North India for the period 700 AD to about 1200 AD. Joining me as speakers on this episode are Dr. Omar Ali and Jay and Welcome to the episode, gentlemen.
And Gaurav as well.
Yes, we'll have Gaurav. I just realized Gaurav's also joined us. Thank you.
I wouldn't be a speaker, but yeah, sure.
Yeah, please feel free to chip in with your thoughts and ideas. Right. Yeah. So let me start with you, Jay. Jay, when we read about this period in North India, what is the source of our information? How do we know of this age from 700 AD to about 1200 AD in North India?
So mainly when we are talking about sources, so in historical terminology, this period from 700 onwards to 1200 AD or 1300 AD, the date is not exact, but this period is called early medieval period in early medieval Indian history. So here the main sources, particularly when we are talking about Indian rulers and their dates and all that. For this, the main sources are the land grants which these rulers gave to different brahmanas and also to their other officials. So these land grants provide us the main information about most of these different dynasties and rulers of these dynasties who ruled this part. So basically, we have in most of these land grants, there are multiple copper plates in which sometimes genealogies of kings are written, and then we have something about the king who granted a particular land. So that is this is the main source for us when we are talking about this period. Apart from this period is also the period when we see another genre in Sanskrit literature that became popular. So in the earlier episode, we had discussed Bana's Harshcharitra. So after Bana's Harshcharitra, we see that multiple works which are royal biographies, Charitra. So these works were composed by different court poets. So some of the more important ones are Gaudavaho. Gaudavaho is composed by a court poet called Vakpati, and interestingly, this is a Prakrit work which is unique because most of the time the works which were composed during this period were in Sanskrit. Then we see what some of these court poets used to do is, like, there is this text called Ramacharita. So this text tells the story of Pala king Rampal, and also simultaneously we see that the story of Lord Ram is also being told. Then there is this text called Kumar Pal Charit. So this is about a Gujarati king, Kumar Pal, and on one side we have the story of Kumar Pal, and on the other side, the author Hemchandra teaches us illustrates the rules of Sanskrit grammar. So this is quite unique. And one important text which I think would become important since there is this movie coming out about Prithviraj. So this is Prithviraj Vijay. And the interesting thing about this text is, although it is relatively not well known, but it is the only contemporary text, Sanskrit text, which we have of Prithviraj Chauhan's period. And this is not a complete text. The end of the text is missing, and most scholars believe that this title, Prithviraj Vijay, so this victory of Prithviraj was composed when Prithviraj Chauhan achieved the first victory over Muhammad Ghori in the first battle of Tarayan, and even the authorship of this text is debated. So, And then we have multiple Arab sources, because during this period, the interaction between these two cultures really started. So Arab sources, and finally we have Al-Baruni's account. And if you are looking at Kashmir, we have the famous Raj Tarangani of Kalhan.
Right.
And these are, the Arab sources, which are really actually mostly now Persian or Persianate kind of sources for the Delhi Sultanate and stuff, are quite extensive. But recently you've also had a number of people trying to suggest that they are just exaggerated fictions and not reliable history. And I'm quite sure they are very exaggerated, but at the same time, I don't think that this is a good faith criticism. There seems to be a sort of some of the things they relate are now considered ungood, not something that we want to teach our children, and so that their credibility is being undermined. But I think their credibility is not that low. They do relate the history in detail, but they of course exaggerate the kings that they are praising. That is definitely the case.
Omar, can you give us an example of one of these Persian accounts that you've been just talking of, especially anything that was...
I think the most famous, and Jay probably knows more than I do, but the most famous is Ziauddin Barani's history, written in the Delhi Sultanate. He was a contemporary of Muhammad bin Tughlaq. He was actually his or something. And he wrote a detailed history of the Delhi Sultanate, and it's written clearly with a kind of a ideal Islamic angle to it, meaning that he's always trying to judge if this sultan was doing things in the proper Islamic way or not, and is very critical of those who were not, and so he also tends to give very proudly relate. The good sultans, in his view, are the sultans who destroyed temples and killed Hindus and whatever, because that's what a good Muslim ruler in those days was supposed to do. But that's why people now feel that he's not a good source, because he gives extensive, like the numbers he gives are clearly exaggerated, I think. But the facts are probably not wrong. They're just exaggerated.
But that's for the Delhi Sultanate period. Jay, what about this period, 780 to about 1200 AD? What are the prominent Arab and Persian sources from which we know what was happening in the subcontinent?
So, Arab sources, one more I wanted to add would be that for the Arab sources, there is a history. The Arabs wrote several histories. It was a sort of a genre for them, which were histories of the conquests, right? The Arab Empire is an empire, obviously, and very in their own mind, there was nothing wrong with being an empire, so they were very proud of it and of their imperial conquests and their imperial actions. So they wrote a number of histories, and the one that has the most, or the one that has reference to the Arab conquest of Sindh, is mostly Al-Baladuri. His history mentions, has several pages on the conquest of Sindh. The other sources have, like Tabari and the other famous Arab historians, only have like a page or two. Don't give a lot of detail about the conquest of Sindh. The other big source that people used to use or still use is the Chachnama. Is a source, is a Persian book written in Uch in Sindh in the 12th, 13th century sometimes, which is supposedly a translation of an earlier Arabic work. That's how the book is framed. There's a Pakistani-American historian, Manan Ahmad, who has written a book called A Book of Conquest, in which he has tried to argue that the Chachnama is probably fake, that there is no Arab original which was being translated, that the people in Uch Sharif wanted to write a history and invented sort of the Arab background to it. But that I think is still disputed, because I read his book. I wasn't convinced that he has any strong argument for why it's a fake. But maybe it is. That's an ongoing debate right now about how fake it is. Part of it is probably is fake, but how fake it is the issue.
Right.
One important point about the Ghaznavids, particularly Mahmud Ghazni's conquest. There is this text called Tariq-e-Behagi, and this is the primary text when we talk about Ghaznavid Empire. So this is the most important text. And even other later Persian sources, like when in Deccan, there's this Persian historian, I forgot his name, he's the most important historian, but he wrote in, I think, in 17th century. So he also uses these sources and tells the story, but mainly Tariq-e-Baihaqi and Minhaj-us-Siraj, Tariq-e-Firoz Shahi. So these are the important works, Persian works, that deals with these early period. They are particularly concerned with the establishment of Islam in this part of the world.
Right. So we know about this era from land grants, which were, you could argue, were the earliest land records, or at least land grants. Then we know through biographies commissioned by various rulers of this era, primarily written in Sanskrit, but also some in Prakrit. And then we have Arab and Persian sources of what was happening in this part of the world in this era. Right. So now moving on to, let's go through the political map of the North India in this era, starting with what is present day Afghanistan. And then we move all the way east to Bengal. Jay, would you like to start there? Who are the rulers in what is now Afghanistan and West Pakistan? And then we move from there.
So we are starting around 700 AD.
Yes, we start with 700 AD.
So this period in Afghanistan, most likely we can say that, the later Kidarites or Huns who had invaded India, they were controlling this region. And although most of our sources, like Huan Sang is the main source when we talk about this region, and from his writing, they were Buddhists, and they controlled this region of Afghanistan. And when we move to Kashmir, for example, in Kashmir, in Kalhan's Raj Tarangani, the history of this period particularly is kind of not that great, because for example, in Kalhan we have the whole Gupta period. We are told that a king of Gondwana dynasty ruled for 300 years. So Kalhan does not provide us a good information about Kashmir also. But what we can say is that around 700 AD, Kashmir was also under the influence of the Hunas or Kidarites. And it was only around the mid of 8th century when the Karkot dynasty established by Durlabh Vardhan, that we see, Kalhan really starts to make much more sense. And when we move to the region of Punjab and Haryana, there is a debate among scholars of early medieval period, because there is this earlier view, which was that after the death of Harsha, what we see is that there was a period of anarchy of 50 years or so. But most scholars nowadays believe that the Harsha's empire was not that great. So most of the time, this whole region, first of all, we don't have enough information about what happened after the death of Harsha. So this from 650 onwards to 700, 715 period, there is not much information. But what we see is that around 714 or so, in Kannauj, there is this person who gets the throne of Kannauj, whose name is Yashovarman. And Yashovarman conquers this region of Punjab, Haryana, and the region of Bihar and Bengal. We know this because there is this, I have already mentioned the text called Gaudavaho. So in Gaudavaho, we have information about this. But Gaudavaho talks about the slaying of the Gauda king. So Gauda king is the king of Bengal. But about the region of Punjab, we know that Yashovarman controlled the region of Punjab and Haryana, because first there are some coins of Yashovarman that are found from this region. And then there is this there is a later text which tells us that the court poet which wrote Gaudavaho, whose name was Vakpati, also wrote a text called Madra Mahi Vijay. So Madra was the region of Punjab. So the fact that this court poet wrote this poem, which is now lost, suggests that the region of Punjab and Haryana was also under the control of Yashovarman. So Yashovarman is now controlling from Punjab to roughly we can say the Bengal region, and in the region of Gujarat, the Rashtrakutas had control over this region. And what we see is that when around 724 AD in Kashmir, another Karkota ruler whose name is Lalitaditya becomes the new king, and Lalitaditya goes on a Digvijay and he conquers. This is Rajatarangani. So Rajatarangani says that he first conquered some region in Central Asia and Afghanistan, northwest frontier province of Pakistan, and Western Punjab, Kannauj was conquered, Bengal was conquered, Deccan was conquered, Konkan, and whole Rajputana, and finally he returned to Kashmir. So this is what Raj Tarangani talks about, the Digvijay of Lalitaditya. So this is the period of 8th century, mid of 8th century. And after 8th century onwards, 9th century, starting from 9th century, we have this famous struggle between three great powers of India. So in Bengal, we have the Palas. In Rajputana and this region of Madhya Desh around Kannauj, we have the Pratiharas, Gurjar Pratiharas, and in Deccan, Western Deccan particularly, we have the Rashtrakutas. So this struggle with the Rashtrakutas and Palas and Pratiharas, which in historical terminology is called tripartite struggle. So this tripartite struggle begins around 9th century, and it goes to this continues to around 200 years. And after this, we have a fragmented polity in which Chauhanas are ruling the region of Rajasthan, some parts of Delhi and Haryana, and in the Gangetic Plains, the region of present-day UP was controlled by the Gahadwals. So this is a rough overview I have provided.
And so I would add to that if you are starting around 700 AD, this is the time of the first kind of Islamicate invasion of India, is 711 AD, Muhammad bin Qasim's invasion of Sindh. And as you know, the Arab Empire had started, the Umayyad Empire had conquered a very large territory by that time. And it was a very consciously sort of expansive empire. The aim in theory was to conquer the whole world, right? It was a normal thing, if you read the histories of that period, for the caliph and his governors were 24/7 worrying about where to attack next. So one of the obvious things after you conquer Iran is to start thinking about Makran and Sindh. There were Arab incursions into Makran very early in the 640s or so AD, which didn't get very far. They definitely did not get to Sindh, but they got to some part of Makran, and that became an Arab province also. And then there were civil wars within the Arab Caliphate. So there were Shia rebels who had sort of taken refuge in that area, and some of them ended up in Sindh also. So some people think that pursuing these rebels was why they faced that way. But I think you don't really need a complicated explanation. They were thinking of invading wherever they went. So once they were in Iran, they were bound to think a little further. So at some point, Hajjaj bin Yusuf, the powerful governor of sort of the eastern half of the empire, decided to send expeditions to conquer Sindh. There's a very fancy story about how some Muslim women coming back from Sri Lanka were taken by pirates, and their screams were heard by Hajjaj, and he sent Muhammad bin Qasim to rescue them. which is kind of fake because even if there was such an episode, the original Arabic sources put that episode much earlier. It wasn't Muhammad bin Qasim's invasion; it was the earlier efforts that were triggered by such a hostage taking at some point. But anyway, Muhammad bin Qasim's invasion was the third time that he tried, and this time they made serious preparations. And again, the sources are very clear about how these things were handled. The Caliph gave permission. The governor sanctioned funds. They sanctioned something like 60,000 dirhams to fund the army. 6,000 people were recruited. This and that, and the governor had sort of told the Caliph that he's going to bring back more money than is being spent on this expedition. And of course, eventually he did, and that justified the conquest. So Muhammad bin Qasim's invasion of Sindh, which was ruled by this Brahmin dynasty and Raja Dahir, he was defeated. Sindh was conquered. He conquered up to Multan and a little beyond that. Multan was, of course, a big prize because there was this huge sun temple in Multan, which they took over. And after, according to the Chajnama, I think, after killing a cow there and sort of proving that they were in charge now, they actually let the temple continue to function because they collected money from it. But that was the first sort of contact with India for the Arabs. After that, there was some Arab attempt to extend this further after Muhammad bin Qasim's death, and Junaid, I think the governor, tried again to extend further towards Rajasthan, but was stopped by a Rajput confederacy or by someone. Jay will know the name. I don't remember the Indian name that well. But there was a confederation that managed to stop them. I don't think it was a big event, but these were relatively small armies. But the Arab conquest did not extend beyond Sindh at that point. And so that's where the contact remained until the next invasion, which is Mahmud Ghaznavi's invasions, which we'll get to later.
Right. So, Omar Sahab, for our listeners, who are the rulers of Sindh? You mentioned a Brahmin dynasty. Who are the rulers of Sindh? And I remember reading a dynasty called Shahis who were ruling Afghanistan at that time. Can you throw some light on who were the rulers of Afghanistan and this part of Sindh when Muhammad bin Qasim attacked?
Yeah. Again, I'll ask Jay to give us the names. I don't want to mispronounce or give wrong information. But the rulers of Sindh, the Indian side of things is not that well documented, right? So there's always this question. There are some controversies about all these things. But the dynasty that was ruling Sindh had taken over relatively recently and were supposedly a Brahmin origin dynasty. But prior to that, there were other rulers. And again, I'm sorry, Jay will have to update us on who the earlier dynasty was. And Raja Dahir was ruling over Sindh at that time. So it's a relatively small state. But that state was, and then in the north, the Hindu Shahis around this time or a little later would be ruling in the northwest. Right, Jay? This would be the time. In Punjab and that region, the rulers would be Hindu Shahis?
No, they came a little later because
they came a little later.
This was the period when Kashmir controlled this area.
Right. And then the Hindu Shahis came.
Right.
And the Hindu Shahis themselves, there's some argument about what they were, but I think probably a Kshatriya or Kayast dynasty or whatever who had taken over that region.
Right. So what we've figured out so far is that this between 700 till about 1000 AD, there were three large kingdoms. Once there was some political stability after the death of Harshvardhan, which were primarily Palas, Pratiharas, and Rashtrakutas. Jay, would that be a fair submission?
Yes, but I would just add something to which Umar Saab has just said. I think this period when Junaid becomes the next commander of Sindh, leads the armies into Al-Hind proper, as the Arab sources would say. I think the Arab sources does not really talk about these invasions or raids, but when you read inscriptions of Indian inscriptions, it is I believe that they made significant attempts to conquer to invade India proper, because from the north we find that during the reign of Yashovarman, a attempt was made to conquer Kannauj, and even when we moved to Gujarat, there were multiple attempts to conquer Kannauj, to conquer Gujarat region, and there are inscriptions that describes the Tajika. So in Sanskrit inscriptions, the Arabs are called Tajika. So Tajika is a Pahlavi term which is derived from a Pahlavi term which is Tazik, and some scholars believe that this Pahlavi term Tazik was originally derived from a Arab tribe Tai. So this this term Tajika is used in Indian sources, and there is a invasion that happened during this 724 to 750 period, and this raid or invasion, whichever we want to call it, the Arab army went as deep as Ujjain, so in central India proper. So, and here we are told that this army was defeated by Nagbhatta. He has a inscription in Gwalior, and this inscription talks about that he defeated a Maliksha king. So I believe they made some serious attempts to conquer this India, but that didn't happen. And we find that after Junaid, the next commander is Tamim, I think. So Tamim did not really made these the attempts like Junaid did. So ultimately it was stopped.
Right. And then the small statelet that they, meanwhile, the Abbasid Caliphate itself started to fall apart, right? So that united caliphal armies were no longer a threat. But a small sort of Arab statelet in Sindh survived, and in fact was later broken up into a northern statelet, which was controlled by Ismailis, centered around Multan, and a southern one controlled by Sunnis, which was named Al-Mansura. And the Mansura statelet has a sort of a echo in Pakistan now, because the Jamaat-e-Islami looks back at that statelet as the sort of the first Pakistan, right? The first Muslim state in India. And so they have named their headquarter Al-Mansura. So if you go to Lahore and go to the Jamaat-e-Islami's headquarter, it's located in Al-Mansura.
Another point which, since Umar Sahab had talked about this, interestingly, what we find is that Sindh was conquered first, and it was only around the end of 8th century or the start of 9th century when these two kingdoms of Afghanistan, Zabul and Kabul, were finally completely conquered. Before this period, what we find that they used to make raids, and they used to depose these kingdoms of these rulers of Kabul and Zabul, and when the Arab army would return, these rulers would again overthrow the garrisons of Arabs. So it is interesting that Sindh was conquered before Afghanistan was fully conquered.
Right. And in fact, in Afghanistan, in Zabulistan, there was an Arab army that was completely annihilated on one of those expeditions. Something like 15,000, 20,000 people were killed. There's an Arab name for it, the Doomed Army or something. So they had setbacks in Afghanistan much longer than they did in Sindh.
So Afghanistan has a history of a tough place to conquer.
It usually does. It does, yeah. But it is physically a difficult place to go through. So obviously,
right. So
also,
now
I think one thing we can maybe add that position is that the early Islamic invasions were centered from Arab lands, whereas the later ones were from Central Asia. So that's when Afghanistan started becoming the marchlands, so to speak.
Right.
So, Jay, let's talk about the Palas. Tell us what is their origin, what is their backstory, what was the spread of their kingdom, and how did they go about ruling?
About the Palas, the story is quite interesting about their founder, whose name is Gopal. And from inscription, we learn that he was elected. So by election, this was not a normal election in our modern sense, but some scholars believe that they were not of Kshatriya origin, and the origin is a matter of debate. But still, from the main ruler, which expanded the Pala power, was Dharampal, and Dharampal ruled from around the end of 8th century, so around 798. His rule starts from this. And the Pala had their base in the Gauda region. So Gauda region is the present-day West Bengal region. So from there, they expanded west, and during the reign of Dharampal, Dharampal managed to put a puppet king on the throne of Kannauj. I think this puppet king was called Krishna Yudh, and this act of Dharampal, which began this whole tripartite struggle. So this is about Pal dynasty.
And just for our listeners, what is the time period we are talking of?
So Dharampal time period is around 798 to 815. So this is Dharampal.
Right. So the Pala kingdom spreads from what is now present-day West Bengal to Kannauj, which is Western UP.
Yes, and a little beyond Kannauj.
Right. What about Pratiharas? What is their backstory and where do they rule?
So about Pratiharas, and this is a controversial topic in the sense that the name Gurjar Pratihar is, there are two views in this matter. So one side believes that this name Gurjar Pratihar was given to the Rajput ruler who ruled the Gurjar Desh. So Gurjar Desh was the region of Gujarat and some parts of Rajasthan and Madhya Pradesh. So this was the region of Gurjara, and those Rajput rulers who ruled this were called Gurjar Pratihara. Now, this is one side. Then some scholars argue that these Gurjar Pratiharas were earlier a nomadic tribe, and the Gurjars of modern subcontinent. These Gurjars were descendants of Gurjar Pratihara. So one branch of the Gurjaras went on to form a imperial dynasty called the Gurjar Pratiharas. This is a very heated debate that is going on in historical circles. But Gurjar Pratihara, the Nag Bhatt first, who I have mentioned previously, so he was considered, there were multiple centers of Gurjar power. So he was the one person who established the main dynasty, which some scholars call the Imperial Pratiharas. And after Nag Bhatt first, so one of the main rulers was the fourth ruler of this dynasty, whose name was Vatsaraj. So during the reign of Vatsaraj, we see that this struggle with the Palas starts. So what Vatsaraj does is he defeats Dharampal, and so this is about the Gurjar Pratihar.
And what's the spread of their kingdom like?
So they basically controlled the region of some parts of Gujarat, complete Rajputana, and if you include Kannauj, so basically up to the middle Ganga Valley.
Right.
So one question there, Jay. What about the legends, or not legends per se? What about the historical view that these Gurjar Pratiharas were formed after consolidation of the later Hunas with the landowning or Kshatriya elites of sorts? So that I think the recent genetic work is quite extensive to go against that theory that the newly formed Rajputs were somehow descendants of the Huns. But why does this theory come up? I mean, what's the origin of that?
I think one of the major historians, R.C. Majumdar had this view, if I'm not wrong. And even today, I think I'm not familiar with the genetic, this study, but in the historical documents, historical articles which we read, which as a history student read, we still have this this debate of the Gurjar Pratiharas and the origin of the Rajputs being of a Hanik extraction. So this is still persist, and I frankly I don't have any answer to this why it does.
Yeah, like that's the case. Like some of the theories on the face of it, they appear very ridiculous, and we don't like as a student of history per se, we don't really know. So when you go on investigating, where did it start? There seems to be no solid like base for that. Just someone's speculation gets mainstream in the next generation, and that becomes a mainstream theory. Like just an interesting observation. But yeah.
Umar sir, what have you read about this period? Your thoughts?
I have actually read almost nothing other than the Wikipedia page about the Indian side of, or the sort of the Hindu side of things in this era. To us, it used to be just like a black hole. There's nothing, we knew nothing about it in school. We had no idea what those dynasties are and where they ruled and what they did. So from school textbooks and so on, obviously we were taught a lot about Muhammad bin Qasim and Mahmud Ghaznavi and this part. And from my own interest also, I've been sort of reading about those topics for a while. So I can comment more about those people and their invasions, but much less about the people they were invading. I actually know very little about them.
Right, sure. So this tripartite struggle lasts 200 years, as we discussed, Jay. Who prevails? So we are talking now 950 AD or 950 AD. Who is the dominant player in North India, present-day North India, and parts of Sindh and Punjab in Pakistan? Who's the dominant political player?
The end is somewhat of a defeat of all the three sides, because what we see is that if you have to view it as a conquest, so I think no one would deny that the Rashtrakutas were at the top, and second were and in the second were the Gurjar Pratiharas, and the last position was for the Palas, because the Gurjar Pratiharas had their base in Malyakhete or Malkhed, as we call it present day. So this is in northern Karnataka, and from this region they invaded 3 times in north, and in 2 times they defeated so in the first invasion, which happened so this was the rural of the Rashtrakutas was a person called Dhruv. So what he did was, like the Pala ruler was defeated by the Gurjar Pratihara ruler, and now the Pala ruler was again trying to build his army and again counter the Gurjar Pratihara. So this Dhruv, the Rashtrakuta king, what he decides is he times his expedition so perfectly that the major army, or the main army of the Pratiharas and the Palas are somewhere around the eastern UP region, and Kannauj is just lying unprotected. So what Dhruv does is he first conquers the Malwa region, and when this Pratihara ruler Vatsraj learns that the army of the Rashtrakutas is close to conquering Kannauj, he rushes a small detachment of troops, which Dhruv easily defeats. And after defeating the Pratiharas, Dhruv goes and defeats the Palas. So this was the first expedition which Rashtrakutas accomplished, although Kannauj was not conquered. Then the second time this the same thing happened. They defeat the Pratiharas, and they did not fight any battle with the Palas because Palas surrendered. And the third time, eventually, during the reign of Indra III, I think Indra III, yes, during the reign of Indra III, which is around 914 to 927, Kannauj was conquered. And since the Rashtrakutas had their base in the Deccan, they could not maintain this hold for a long time, so they eventually returned. So Kannauj was left for the Pratiharas. But what happened was that both of these three dynasties or powers, eventually they collapsed because of this intense struggle that went on for 200 years.
Right. So which is the succeeding state? So we know Rashtrakutas exerted some influence till as north as Western UP. So once their power sort of dissolves in this part of the world, who is the succeeding state? Or is it a fragmented polity like it was at the end of Harshvardhan's rule, and we have smaller players in this part of the world?
Yes, because when the Gurjar Pratiharas eventually declined, the new kingdoms of Rajputs, Rajput kingdoms emerged. For example, we have the Chahmanas or Chauhans, as they were later called. Although the first inscriptions are quite early, so most of these rulers were under the feudatories of the Gurjar Pratiharas. And when the Gurjar Pratiharas declined, they eventually they established their own rule. So in the region of Ajmer and Ajmer region, we have the Chauhans, and the region of Gujarat, we have the Chalukyas or Solankis. So there is always this confusion between Chalukyas and Chalukyas. So Chalukyas are the Solanki Rajputs. So this is just a small trivia. And the region of since we are going to discuss Khajuraho. So Khajuraho was built by the Chandelas, and Chandelas were the feudatories of the Rashtrakutas. So we see that in the region of Bundelkhand and this region, the Chandelas established their rule. And Palas, interestingly, the Pala decline happened because of, there are multiple theories, but some believe that the expedition of Rajendra Chod that happened around the start of 11th century, this was the main reason that saw the decline of the Palas. And after the Palas, we have the Senas. So Senas ruled up to, I think, 13th century when Islam entered Bengal.
Right. So one thing there, Jay. So there has been this view that the Rashtrakutas were very rich compared to the Pratiharas because of the trade linkages they had, because of the large coastline they controlled. And what about were the Pratiharas, because the trade outside India, we talked about it in the previous episode, that how the trade outside India might have been restricted after around the time of Harsha itself. So was the Pratihara kingdom comparatively less economically dominant than the Rashtrakutas, so as not been able to exert their control?
Yes, I think there is this theory that the Rajputas were able to, exert their influence up to northern India, was mainly because of the amount of, the benefits they enjoyed because of the Arab trade. And in the Arab sources, interestingly, the Pratiharas are called the enemies of the Islam or enemies of the Arabs. And whereas the Rashtrakutas were quite friendly terms with the Arabs. And we find that there was there's this inscription of the Rashtrakutas, in which we are told that is Mandal of Samian. So Mandal is roughly a district or more area. So this whole district was governed by a person called Madhumati. So this Madhumati was a Tajika. And most scholars believe that Madhumati was the Sanskritized version of Muhammad. So the Rashtrakutas had, given a district to govern to an Arab, and there were multiple localities that were established in the Konkan region and in Gujarat also. That there were also some Arabs, and apart from Arabs, there were also some Jews and also some Persians. So there was, the Rashtrakutas did enjoy a great deal because of their trade. The Pratiharas, on the other hand, were landlocked, so they could not really benefit much.
So, Omar Saab, as the polity in this part of the world is fragmenting, how's the Islamic influence and the Islamic invasion, how's that phenomena getting played out?
So within the, the Islamic Empire started with the Umayyad Caliphate, and then that was overthrown by the Abbasides. So that's the second Arab dynasty ruling the empire, which the Abbasides ruled from, the Morocco all the way to Central Asia. So it's a huge empire. But by the 9th century, it had started to weaken, and by the 10th century, it was falling apart. They did not have a great model for how to how to handle their soldiers. They got soldiers from Turkish slaves that they had taken in Central Asia. But as these soldiers realized soon enough, they were the ones with the arms, so they got to bully the sultans and caliphs. So the caliphs just became sort of puppets in the hands of these soldiers. And different governors started to create their own independent kingdoms. So one of those early independent kingdoms is the Samani kingdom in Central Asia, which was a Persianized state, right? These people were sort of brought back the pre-Islamic Persian culture a lot and adopted a new Persian as their language. And so this was a transition from being an Arab empire to becoming this part of the Islamic world, becoming a kind of various Persianate empires. In the Afghan region, the one Turkic warlord, actually Turkic slave, descendant of a Turkic slave, Subuktigin, became the ruler around Ghazni. And his son, Mahmud, became the first person probably to use the title of Sultan, which just means powerful. So the idea was to differentiate. He's not the caliph, but at the same time, he's no longer just a governor or a feudal, feudatory of the caliph. He's an independent ruler. So this in-between term of sultan was invented for him, and then of course taken up by a lot of other people. So Mahmud Ghaznavi became a very powerful ruler. Militarily, he clearly had some talent, but he fought with everyone. So he fought with the other Turks around him. He fought with his own brother to become the king, actually. And then, of course, while doing all this fighting, you run out of money, and the nearest place with a lot of money was India. So then his economic policy was to invade India every year and collect a lot of booty. And this system of invasions started around 1000 AD and continued until his death. And of course, the famous figure is 17 invasions. Now, some historians will try to argue that these are exaggerations by the British, and we shouldn't call them invasions. Maybe they were raids. Maybe they were not even 17. Or some people will turn it around and say that every year he had to go to India to sort of collect funds, something benign like that. But anyway, he made all these invasions. And so he is the one who established a kind of a Muslim presence in Northwest India by conquering Lahore and incorporating it into his kingdom. His time also was the time when al-Biruni came to India. And, Abu Rehan al-Biruni is one of the most famous of the scientists produced in the Islamicate world, and one of the great scientists of world history, actually. A very, very talented man, very, very brilliant man. He was captured by Mahmud in one of his expeditions northwards, and then brought as a sort of a hostage, really, to his kingdom, to his capital, where Mahmud liked to collect all these people. He collected every, famous poet and intellectual he could find, although he didn't treat them very well. They were all unhappy with him in their private thoughts. Firdausi, of course, being the most famous, or the most famous Persian poet of the age, who wrote the Shahnama and then did not get enough of a reward from Mahmud and had to run away. when he objected. But anyway, this Mahmud Ghaznavi's invasions were very destructive, terrible affairs. But at the same time, he did bring al-Biruni to India, and al-Biruni wrote one of the early sort of, we were talking about Arab sources and so on. One of the sources is Tarikh al-Hind, written by al-Biruni, where he describes whatever he knows about the history of India, but also, unlike the other Arab chroniclers who are really just interested in the conquest and what happened, who the conquerors were, and whose only mention of Hindus is really to say, we killed so many of them. But al-Biruni was different. He really wanted to learn what knowledge was in India. And he collected information about their philosophy, their mathematics, their astronomy, even about medicine, although he was more interested in astronomy and mathematics, and traveled to various places in India. He was not kept, he was kept on sort of a tight leash by Mahmud. He sort of complained in his book that he wished he had more freedom to go where he wanted and do what he wanted. But of course, working for a sultan, you have to do what the sultan tells you. But he did learn Sanskrit, and he wrote an excellent book about India and about what was going on. And he's a conservative Muslim. He's not like some sort of liberal or anything, and proud of the Islamic invasion or conquest. But at the same time, he tries to be fair, and he tries to give you a good sort of objective description of the India that he found, and their philosophy and their mathematics and astronomy. Definitely, he regards them very highly, and passed on that knowledge into the Arab world. While we're talking about that, I think one of the things we can mention also is that there's this, where is the knowledge of India or the interaction with India that the Islamicate world sort of had. There were 2 or 3 phases in that. The first is when they conquered Sindh, and around that time, a little bit of Indian knowledge was transferred to the Caliphate, and there were a few Indian books that were translated, mostly medicine, astronomy. They were always interested in astrology, right? That was the big thing, and a little bit of mathematics. But then the second interaction is when Mahmud Ghaznavi came, and al-Biruni wrote his book, and around that time, much more is getting translated. And a lot of there is transfer of knowledge. Also, we should mention the Burma Keys. The Burma Keys were the ministers of Mamun and Harun al-Rashid, the most powerful of the Abbasid caliphs. And they were people from Central Asia who had been picked up by Mamun while he was sort of stationed there in Central Asia. And this family is of probably has an Indian connection, because the word Burma is from Pramukh. They were probably Buddhists who, in the intellectual elite of Central Asia, they officially converted to Islam, although I think I vaguely remember reading that even that their contemporaries had their doubts about how genuine the conversion was, but they were very powerful people. And they brought Indian knowledge to Baghdad. They set up a hospital there, which you will hear about a lot, because the Islamic world, the world's first hospital or the world's first medical school, everything becomes the world's first. But that was set up by the Burma Keys and was probably staffed by Indian physicians. So that was a period of when the Burma Keys, there was an extensive transfer of Indian knowledge, including the Panchtantra, the stories, Kalila and Dimna, the stories of Indian origin became very popular in the Arab lands. They translated also a life of the Buddha, and maybe even Vedanta. Some Sufi thought also probably had its origin or took something from the Indian side. And then there's al-Biruni and his interaction during Mahmud Ghaznavi's invasions.
So before I come to Gaurav, Omar Saab, what's the timeline for Ghaznavi's, let's use the word invasion? What are the timelines that we are talking of?
So Ghaznavi became the Sultan somewhere in the 970s or 980s, I think, and then started his invasions of India around 1001, 1002 AD, somewhere around there. And then basically pretty much invaded every year. Just picked a new target every year. He went and looted Mathura, he looted, Thanesar, he looted Somnath, which of course became a very famous raid. And for from the Islamic chronicles, it was regarded as a very big event. But again, there is some pushback now from the eminent historians in India that maybe the reality of the raid was not as described. But that was in 1025.
Right. Gaurav, you were saying something.
Yeah, so one couple of questions to Omar sir. So one about can you just inform the listeners about when did the Central Asian conquest by Islam took place and how firm was the conquest? So you already alluded to someone who were Buddhist and who converted to Islam. So how so there has been a revision in the school even in that history that what we understand as Islam was not quite Islam of the Umayyads or even of the Rashidun Caliphates, but that was when the Abbasid revolution sort of consolidated the power. So by that time, is it fair to say that the people who were the Central Asian Turks who got converted to Islam were not how Muslim were they? How was that dynamic sort of going on? Because we know
the conquest of
just to finish up. So we know for India, the Central Asian horsemen and the Central Asian invaders have been for before this time also 1,000 years or so they had shaped the history of India. The only thing to change at this instance was their conversion to Islam. So because we talked about all of them in earlier episode. So maybe.
So the Central Asian conquest, the conquest of Central Asia by the Caliphate was quite early, right? As soon as it was obviously a Sasanian province. The Iranians used to rule Central Asia. This was all Persianate Central Asia. And the Turks were people beyond the Persian rule and were not really Islamized early on. The first part of Central Asia that the Muslims conquered was what used to be the Central Asian provinces of the Iranian Empire. And when these were conquered, I think, what was his name? Qutb bin Muslim or something. I'm trying to remember the name. Anyway, one famous general who led the invasions in Hajjaj bin Yusuf's time. So this is late 600s, right? Late 7th century AD. They conquered Central Asia. And the conquest of Central Asia of the Transoxiana was completed before the conquest of Afghanistan. So they had not yet taken all of Afghanistan, but they had taken the western edge and they had moved on and taken most of Central Asia. The people they had converted were not Turks early on. They were Persianized Central Asian people, right? Sogdians and these people of Transoxiana, who were long-term sort of civilized Persian people. They were not Turkic tribes as such. The Turks they used to capture as slaves in raids. They would interact with Turkish tribes on their edge and they would capture Turks from there. Turkish conversion happened a little later, but Turkic slaves were being taken, and these Turkic slaves had become Persianized in captivity. So they're like Mahmud of Ghaznavi and his family, Subakhtagin, his dad. These were, Subakhtagin was a Turkic slave of another Turkic slave, I think Alaptagin, who also had, the slave is sort of, brings to mind African-American slaves in America being in chains and whips and whatever. But this is a different kind of slavery. It was slavery. It was not totally benign, but these are people who were captured in wars and then actually kept as slave soldiers. And so they were paid. They would get some of the loot. They would get to rape people when they plundered a city. They were not slaves in that way. And they would get promoted. They would become officers in the army and eventually even generals in the army. And some of these generals then started their own kingdoms. So that's when the Turkic kingdoms started, right? So Mahmud of Ghaznavi is one of the early ones. And these Turkic kingdoms were culturally Persianized, though. There were not a lot of Turkic cultural influence at that point. These are mostly Persianized states. And they are the ones who started the invasions of India at that point. And as you said, the invasions of India from the northwest is not something new. Many different nomadic groups of sort of wild warriors had done that already. And they could sometimes penetrate quite far, but they did not have a cultural weapon in their armory, sort of. They would adopt the culture of the people, the more civilized people they conquered, actually. So the earlier invaders, the Huns, the Scythians, they came to India and they eventually became Indian. But the difference in this case, once the Central Asian Islamic invasion started, in terms of loot and plunder and warrior caste and so on, they were not much different from the earlier invasions. They had the same policies and the same kind of aims and objectives, really. But the difference was that they did carry a very strong religious identity with them, and that made all the difference, right? That they were, as warriors, they must have been hardy and capable, because these adventurers, you don't see Bengali adventurers conquering states in Central Asia, but you see people from all the way, Khiljis from Central Asia, riding clean across North India and conquering Bengal in 1206 AD, right? These are not, and then holding it, not just conquering and looting is one thing, but holding it for the next 100 years. These are people who clearly had some military skill, whatever else they had or did not have.
Right. And one more misconception, like just for history nuts. So in the popular history, like we had that series on Mughals recently on Hotstar, or even Padmavat. So these people are generally cast as Afghans or Pakistani looking people, but they were most probably of the Mongoloid facial description, right? So they were Turks. They were Central Asians.
Turks, although Turks are sort of, I think they're in between, right? They have more Eastern Mongolian kind of ancestry than obviously the Persianate Central Asians. But at the same time, it's a gradual shading. So they didn't look that different from the rest of the people of Central Asia, the Persianized people of Central Asia. But yeah, they would have been fairer looking. Different sort of Afghan Central Asian look would be different from what the typical Indian.
Right. So Jay, I'll come back to you. While this is going on the Western frontier, we know of two, let's talk about two, let me use the word phenomenons. One about a king called Mihir Bhoj, and then the famous temples of Khajuraho. Could you throw light on, first, let's take Mihir Bhoj. What's his background? Which is the area he's ruling? What's his contribution? What's his legacy? And then we'll come to the Chandelas and the temples that they built in Khajuraho.
Mihir Bhoj was the one of the great rulers of the Imperial Pratiharas, and we can say that most of the northern India and up to the river Narmada was was part of his kingdom. And interestingly, the city of Kannauj, for the first time, although the Pratiharas did have claim over the Kannauj region and the Kannauj city itself, but as the capital of the Imperial Pratiharas, it was only during the reign of Mihir Bhoj that we see that this, for the first time, Kannauj became the capital of the Imperial Pratiharas. And he's also described by an Arab traveler whose name is Suleiman. So he describes his, the large army and the large cavalry that he had maintained. And the Palas were, because earlier the Pala rule had, they controlled the region of Bihar, up to Bihar. But during the reign of Mihir Bhoj, he was able to, push back the Palas up to their Gauda region. So Mihir Bhoj pretty much, put an end to the Pala supremacy over this region. And today, like, although we most of his building, the buildings which he constructed, most of it are in central India. But this Kannauj region was his main center, I think. And about the second ruler, whose name was?
No, so I'll just summarize. So we are talking, Mihir Bhoja was a Pratihara king who sort of, his capital was Kannauj, and at his peak, would it be fair to say that the Pratihara rule peaked? Or was there any other prominent Pratihara king?
Yes. I think it would be right to say so.
Right, right. Then we were talking of Chandelas and their contribution, the temples in Khajuraho. Can you tell us about the Chandelas and something about these temples?
So about the Khajuraho itself, like it is not only a Hindu temple. We see that there were also Jain and Shaivite and Vaishnav images that were present. So it is, and interestingly, traditionally it was believed that there were around 80 temples that were present in Khajuraho, and right now there are around 25 temples that has survived. So although of these 25 temples, three temples I think are most important for us to know. So the first is a temple called Chausat Yogini Temple. So Chausat Yogini Temple is a Yogini temple. An interesting aspect of the Yogini temple is that the central shrine is not that important compared to the perimeter. So these Chausat Yoginis are placed around the perimeter of the main shrine, and there were small alcoves where these yoginis were placed, and they were worshipped there. And Chausat Yogini temple was, according to most art historians, was the initial phase of architecture in this region, and it dates back to around the 9th century. Because although there are no inscriptions there, but we can see that because most of the Khajuraho temples were constructed from the sandstone, whereas this temple was constructed using granite, and the craftsmanship is also they were roughly cut, and it is quite simple in its iconography. So that is why we say that this was a earlier construction. And then there is this temple called Lakshman Temple, which is the best preserved Khajuraho temple. And we have an inscription of this, and this dates back to around 954 AD. The largest is the Khandariya Mahadev temple, and this is of 11th century period. And the most important point, before we talk about this, I think the Jain, also I've talked about the Jain images. So Jain images appear relatively at the end of the period. So around the 12th century onwards, we have some Jain shrines there. And I think the Khajurahos are famous for their erotic iconography. And Indian historians are, constantly, we don't have any sources that suggest, why these iconographies were made there. But there are multiple theories. So most of these images these iconographic images, erotic images, are called Maithun images in the sources. So Maithun images, there are multiple theories why these images were constructed there. So one is, I think, is a theory of that this region was the center of a tantric cult, and these images are not really erotic figures. They are a coded language. So the tantric cult use this term called Sandhya Bhasha. So Sandhya Bhasha is literally a form of a coded language. So some scholars believe that since it was a place of tantric cult, so they use these erotic figures to to give a coded message. So this is the one view, and the second is quite simple. So some scholars argue that these images were for against protection against the evil eye. And the third interpretation is most of the British scholars who studied these temple. So these early scholars, they thought that this was the great example of the decadence of the Oriental society. So for them, there was nothing much beyond it. And presently, some scholars have viewed this, that we should view these images as a symbolism of moksha. So we have one, these images represents the reunion of Purusha and Prakriti. So the symbol of moksha is presented through these erotic figures. So I think this is about Khajuraho.
What about Chandelas, the dynasty, the kings who built these temples? What do we know about them? What could have been their motivation for building these kind of temples?
Motivation, I said.
No, fine. So let's talk about Chandelas. What do we know about them? What part of
Chandelas? The earlier ruler was a ruler called Dhang, and he gained his independence, or he achieved a separate kingdom around the end of 9th century. So during this period, Chandelas were most likely the feudatories of the Rashtrakutas, and when the Rashtrakutas began to decline, the Chandelas established themselves, and the Chandela were ruling this region of eastern Malwa, Bundelkhand region, and so this was their territory which they controlled. And the Chandela rule lasted around the Mahmud Ghaznavi, one of the Chandela rulers, whose name I think I have forgotten. So he did try to attempt to block an invasion of Mahmud Ghazni. Vidyadhar, I think, was his name. I forgot the complete name. So Chandelas, I think this is only what I know about the Chandelas. I didn't study that deep about the Chandelas.
Right. A while back, you mentioned Kashmir was ruled by the Karkotas, especially their king Lalitaditya. Any thoughts on that? Can you throw some light on that kingdom and the geography they ruled and what was their influence?
Yes, I think the Kashmir is an interesting period during this period. Is an interesting kingdom during this period because, first of all, the Karkotas are also called the Nagas. So, in some sources, we have this name. And the Karkotas, the first ruler of the Karkotas, were a person called Durlabh Vardhan. And during this period, so this was the period around 626 to 662 AD. And in the previous episode, we had discussed, how Harshvardhan wanted a relic of Buddha to worship, and this was present in Kashmir. So this Durlabh Vardhan had to give this relic to Harshvardhan. So the territory which Durlabh Vardhan controlled was the region of Takshashila, which is the ancient Gandhar region, Hazara district, and the salt ranges which are in Pakistan right now, and this mainly the Western Punjab, Northwestern Frontier Province, and Kashmir. So this was the territory which the Durlabh Vardhan controlled. And when Lalitaditya became the ruler, so initially there are some scholars who believe that the Tang dynasty, Lalitaditya was some sort of a vessel of the Tang dynasty. But we can look at it through another angle, like for the Tangs, Lalitaditya was important because he along with Yashovarman tried to put a stop to Tibetan invasion into India. And in order to to keep the Tibetans busy, because the Chinese were engaged with the Arabs in Central Asia, so for them Lalitaditya was a great person. So because he can he can be deployed against the Tibetans. So that is what we see. And the first phase of Lalitaditya's conquest, most of the present-day Afghanistan and some parts of Central Asia and Punjab was conquered by Lalitaditya. And these conquests, some scholars believe, was mainly because the Chinese introduced or lended Lalitaditya some new technologies. Particularly, we find that the use of heavy cavalry and a new type of armor were introduced because of the Chinese influence, and mainly because of this, that Lalitaditya was able to extend his influence, and his Vijay I have already talked about. So most of these territories which Lalitaditya controlled, so basically we are talking about most of the North India and Afghanistan, all North Pakistan completely, Tarim Basin also, and his end, which happened around 747. We are told that he was fighting somewhere in Tarim Basin, and he lost a battle. So what he did was, he, along with his generals, they all immolated themselves. So that is how Lalitaditya lives came to an end. And after Lalitaditya, we see that most of these territories which were controlled by Lalitaditya, they were all lost, and Kashmir was again reduced to its original size. Since we are going to talk about architecture, I think the Kashmir architecture is an important part, and we will talk about it later.
Sure, you want to talk about that?
Yes, we can talk about this, because I think the architecture of Kashmir is important because first of all, Lalitaditya has completed his Digvijay. So he has conquered most of the northern India and some parts of Deccan. And when he finally reaches Kashmir, he first, builds a new capital, which is called Parihaspur. So Parihaspur, the name itself is quite interesting. Parihas means smile or laughter. So the city of laughter. So Parihaspur he established, and there he built some 2-3 temples. And although most of us know about Martanda temple, but Martanda temple was not the biggest temple which he built. It is popular because most of the structure of the temple is still intact. And in this temple, before we talk about the structure of Martanda temple and its features, the Sun temple, during this period, there were only 2 Sun temples. So the first was in Multan, and the second was the Martanda temple. The later 2 temples, like the Konark and the temple in Gujarat, Modhera, these Sun temples came later. So earlier we had the most important temple was the Sun temple was in Multan, and when Lalitaditya built this Sun temple in Kashmir, so this was the second Sun temple which we know of according to our sources. So the Martanda temple is important and interesting because it has influence of Gupta and Gandhar, which is obvious. But apart from this, there is also the Syrian Byzantine influence which we can see. For example, if you look at the structure of this temple, we see that there are arches, vaults, and the kind of pillars which are most likely of was influenced by the Byzantine architecture. So most of these Byzantine influence, according to scholars, like there is this scholar called Andrewing. So he believes that when the Arabs conquered the region of Syria, Palestine, and Egypt, so the Byzantine architects had no place to go, and most of these new buildings were, the Arabs were not interested in building new buildings. So some of these architects went to Kashmir, and there they provided some influence, and they helped building this Martanda temple. So this is, I think, an important aspect of Kashmir architecture particularly.
Right.
And about Kashmir, one other thing I wanted to say is that it shows you the importance of sort of geography. Supposedly not a very warlike people, but it was physically very difficult to conquer Kashmir. They had the guardians of the passes, and very few people. In fact, even other Indians were not easily allowed into Kashmir. Right? It was only. I think I saw in Al-Baruni's book that only a few Jews were outsiders who had been there, and some, learned Hindus would be allowed to go there. But otherwise, they would not allow anyone to cross the passes and go into Kashmir. And I think when Mahmud Ghaznavi defeated Anandpal, didn't he take refuge in Kashmir for a while?
Yes, yes. They were treated very kindly by the Shahis were treated very kindly by the rulers of Kashmir. They had some relations with the Kashmir rulers.
So now I think we can move to the next invading family, which is the Ghauris.
Before that, Omar Sahib, I just wanted to pick your minds on what was fundamentally changing in the way war was fought, that suddenly these invasions from Central Asia were able to now reach further. I mean, we just mentioned one of the Somnath's pretty far away from Afghanistan or Central Asia. Do you have any thoughts on what was fundamentally changing in war strategies or the way wars were being fought, that these invaders were able to come as far as they could?
Yeah, I don't know if there was a change in technology so much or organization as much as sort of the cultural change, right? The arrival of Islam and the organization of these tribes, which previously might have fought as individual tribes, would now fight under the larger banner of Islam, so could get more people together. And of course had a very warlike and very strong us versus them kind of religion. That probably made a difference. Otherwise, these were cavalry armies, right? These were large cavalry armies with lots of horses. Horses don't do well in India itself, so Indians always had a shortage of horses. Horses would not breed here as well as they do in Central Asia. And so there was this continuous strain of importing horses from Central Asia throughout Indian history, right? You have this thing going on. And these people were obviously people who had horses, who were used to them and rode them from very early childhood, and were very good cavalry fighters. And the Indian, it wasn't completely one-sided though. I mean, if you look at all the battles, very small Indian kingdoms defeated some of these people. It's not like a walkover or anything like that. Battles are battles. Sometimes some people, one side wins and sometimes the other. But there was something cultural going on for sure that made them more persistent invaders than they used to be in the past.
Right. Gaurav, you have
let's hear Jay's thought on that.
Yeah. So one thing, we know that Milinda, also known as Menander, he had invaded Patliputra. So he was also a Bactrian. So the Western Kshatrapas were ruling as south as the place where I live, like almost Maharashtra. So we had invaders coming deep into the subcontinent before. So
right.
Like I am of the opinion that the legacy of these Turks who invaded was more because of the cultural thing. Like they may not have had any distinctive military advantage compared to the earlier rulers. So all earlier rulers mostly at some times invaded and succeeded in conquering India. Just that we don't like look back at them that much as we do as the Islamic invaders.
Right.
Right.
I mean, in some cases, there was a technology edge, like in the invasion of Muhammad bin Qasim's invasion of Sindh, he had brought large catapults with him, which supposedly were an advance or were more advanced than anything the Sindhis had, and also had superior bows and archers, right? They had the kind of I think by that time, the composite bow, which was not yet standard in Indian archers. But so there were some minor technical sort of advantages.
Yeah, but the composite bow had come in with the Shakas and the Hunas, right? They also had the composite bow, right?
Right.
One thing I will add to what Umar Saab and Gauravji had just said. I think one thing which is also important when we talk about the Indian rulers, the fact that the Indian rulers had managed to stop the Arab invasions. I think mainly because of the fact that there was in the north there was a central power that ruled the whole that controlled the northern India. But by the time of Mahmud Ghazni, we see that there was no central power that could defeat or that could challenge Mahmud Ghaznavi. There were multiple powers, and sometimes there are some instances where we can see that even there are the differences between the two Indian powers. Mahmud Ghori took advantage of this, and he allied with a single power, and then was able to attack this. The second important aspect is that from the period of Harsh, there are some scholars who had studied Indian military traditions. They argue that the size of the Guptas had they had brought a revolution in terms of military, because during the Gupta period, the military was much more mobile, and that is how Samudragupta was able to campaign in the south. But by the time of Harsh, there are descriptions of in Pana's Harsh Charitra that the army was so massive, and it took so much time to move to one place to another. Interestingly, there is this text, 14th century text called Prabandh Chintamani, and here the famous Gahadwal king, whose name is Jayachandra, is called Pangu. Pangu means in Sanskrit lame. So he is called lame because we are told that his army is so massive that it stretched from Ganga to Yamuna, and because of this he could not walk easily to one place to another. So this immobility of the Indian armies was greatly exploited by the Turks. And Barni, which Umar Sahab had mentioned in the start. So Barni writes that Balban could easily, the army of Balban, which is around 6,000 to 7,000 horses of horse archers of Balban's army, could easily defeat a 1 lakh infantry of a Hindu Rai or Rana. So, and even in the case of the second battle of Tarayan, the mobile mounted archers of the Turks, they were the main reasons why the army of Prithviraj Chauhan was defeated. So cavalry and mounted cavalry particularly was one of the main reasons why this defeat happened. And another point which I think there is this misconception which we have about the Turkish armies, that most of the time these armies were mounted archers. Although the mounted archers were a significant part of these armies, but there were also some heavy cavalry. And according to some scholars, the Turkish slaves they constitute the heavy cavalry of the Turkish armies. And in Persian, there is this word called Bargustama. This is the term that is used to describe the heavy cavalry.
Sure. So now coming to Muhammad Ghori, what's the political landscape of North India like? Who are the rulers ruling the parts of North India when Muhammad Ghori attacks India for the first time? Jay, would you like to start from there?
Yes. So the region of what we say Punjab, particularly the Pakistani Punjab, and some parts of Indian Punjab also, was under the rule of Ghaznavids. These are called later Ghaznavids. And interestingly, so first Ghori conquered the region, the territory of the later Ghaznavids. And interestingly, if you there are some passages of Prithviraj Vijay that is translated. So in Prithviraj Vijay, the later Ghaznavid ruler, although he is not named, he is called the Lord of the Horses. So you can understand, how important the horses were in the minds of the Indian sources. So first Ghori conquered the region of Punjab, and their center was first the Ghazni region. And around 1186, we see that Lahore became their center. And in the Persian sources, this was Lahore was considered the center of Islam in Hind. And the region, so Satluj was the boundary, I think, between the territories of the Ghurids and the territory of the Chauhans. Now, there are some scholars who believe that the Tomars, who controlled the region of Delhi and Haryana, since they had matrimonial alliance with the Chauhans, most likely the Chauhans also controlled the Tomar territory. So this whole Rajputana region and Haryana and Delhi was under the rule of Prithviraj Chauhan or the Chauhanas. And if we move eastwards, so most of the present day UP and some parts of Bihar was under the rule of the Ghadwals. Now, interestingly, we have this. We believe that Jayachand was most of the time is presented as the ruler of Kannauj. But interestingly, Kannauj, because of the raids of Mahmud Ghazni, it did not, recovered from these destructions. And for the Ghadwals, their center was the city of Varanasi. So Varanasi was their center. So the Ghadwals were ruling in the UP region. From UP to the region of Bihar. So this region is there are not enough sources about this region, so we are not sure which dynasty controlled this region. But there are some view that the Senas, who now controlled the Bengal region, they had some indirect control over this region. Now in the Malwa, we have the Chandelas who ruled. So, and in Gujarat were ruled by the Solanki Rajputs, or Chalukya as we call it. In the sources call this dynasty.
Right. Omar Saab, what do we know about Muhammad Ghori?
So these, as Jay mentioned, these are again a tribe that had taken over from the disintegrating Ghaznavid Empire. There's some dispute, I think, about their origin, whether they are Turkic or Tajik, Persian kind of origin. But in any case, they were Persian speaking and Persianate in culture. And they set up an empire that was basically took over the remains of the Ghaznavid Empire and then started to expand further. The ruler, Muhammad Ghori, had no children of his own, had no sons of his own. So he was, and he relied heavily on his Turkic slave generals. And so these were, his Turkic slaves were like corps commanders or governors in his armies. All the important positions were held by these Turkic slaves. And when he died, so his battle with Prithviraj Chauhan, of course, very famous first battle of Taran, then he lost, but then he came back. And I think in Muslim sources, at least, there is this whole thing about how after he lost, he wouldn't cut his hair, he wouldn't take a bath until he was going to take his revenge on Prithviraj, and he planned for the whole year and came back. But during this time, the Chauhans apparently were not really prepared, were not anticipating that he would be back so soon. I don't know if this is really true or not, but this is what I've sort of vaguely read in some histories from the Persian side, at least. So anyway, they defeated Prithviraj Chauhan, and they conquered Delhi. And Qutbuddin Aibak was his general who conquered Delhi and started the Qutb Minar there as the victory tower, celebrating their victory. And because they happened to conquer Delhi, and Aibak made it one of the sort of centers of his power there, that is the time from which Delhi became the Delhi Sultanate and so on. These Ghauris were just like Mahmud Ghaznavi and so on. The main aim, first of all, was plunder. But even Mahmud, he would make deals with people. He had Hindus in his army. And sometimes people who want to change the sort of the impression of Mahmud will try to highlight the fact that especially his elephant corps, since elephants were unknown in Afghanistan's armies, they were taken from India. And the people who managed these elephants and who rode them into battle were all Indians. And presumably they were Hindus, because the quarter where they were kept was called the area of the Hindwan in Ghazni. So there were Hindus serving in his army. There was even a couple of, I think, times when a general or a minor governor or someone that he appointed in his Indian territories was a Hindu. So these are rulers. They make deals, they make compromises. But at the same time, their main aim was plunder, and they were very clear in their own mind about their, being a very different culture and religion, and being mujahids and jihadis in their own mind. That too cannot be denied, and it's sort of silly now that some historians are trying to turn that around. So after he had set up his base in this area, so basically Punjab, Haryana, area around Delhi, all of this became part of the Ghurid Empire. And when Muhammad Ghori died, since he had no sons, his slave generals divided up the empire between them. And actually, there were 3 of them in the Indian area. Aibak took over in the Delhi to Lahore area, and in Multan, Nasiruddin Kabacha became the ruler. And his statelet also lasted for a while. He actually fought the Mongols at some point. And then there was a third one, Tahir Yildiz, who took over in Ghazni itself, or in Ghor in Afghanistan. So the empire sort of split up after that. And then the descendants of these Turkic governors became the sultans of Delhi and started the Delhi Sultanate. Of course, Nasiruddin Kabacha would have wanted his own sultanate to continue in Multan, but his empire or his kingdom did not last. So the one that lasted was the one in Delhi, and the man who sort of made it last or set it up as a lasting enterprise was Iltutmish, the father of Razia Sultana, right? The next ruler after Aibak, who was probably the most talented of the lot, and who was also pragmatic.
Sorry to interrupt, Omar,
Yeah.
but so we skipped on to the Delhi Sultanate part maybe a bit prematurely here.
Right,
So we were planning that for the next episode. Just just one thing, Jay and Omar. So between Ghazni and Ghori, so something which we skipped over also now. Maybe it's also the case in the popular histories, but there is a good span of 150 years, if I'm not mistaken, right? Between Mahmud of Ghazni and Muhammad Ghori and the Battle of Tarin.
Mm-hmm. No, but the Ghaznavi, after Mahmud Ghaznavi died, his sons were not as capable. So Masood lost most of his empire, but there was still a rump Ghaznavi empire, and Lahore continued to be under their control. So from Ghazni to Lahore, this northwest corner was in their control until somewhere around 1150 or so, I think.
Yeah.
And then the Ghori took over.
So what we understand as what we today recognize as the territory of Pakistani Punjab, that was that was part of the core Ghaznavid Empire.
That was
before,
yes. Lahore was their center. That's why Lahore became the earliest sort of Indian center of Muslim rule in this.
Yeah. So whom did the Ghaznavids conquer Lahore and Punjab from?
Ghaznavids from Anandpal, right? From the the Hindu Shahis.
Yeah.
Another important point which I think Gauravji had talked about, this period between Ghazni and Ghori. I think there are 3 important instances which I think we should talk about, because these important incidents are not discussed. So around just after the death of Mahmud Ghazni, his nephew, who is Sayyid Salar Masood Ghazi, so he tried to conquer the region of Awadh, and around the Bahraich area, he was, his army was annihilated and he was also killed. And there is this mazar of Salar Masood Ghazi there. And interestingly, the gazetteers of the British gazetteers talk about that in Faizabad region. We are told that in night, people don't travel on the roads, because the headless troops of Salar Masood Ghazi's army roam the roads of Faizabad. So you can just perceive how long-lasting this memory of this defeat was, because the gazetteers also talk about that most of these Muslim settlements in Awadh claim that their descendants were from the soldiers of this army who had survived. And another important point, that first time Varanasi or Banaras was raided was also during this period around 1033. So there is this commander who was the son of Mahmud, I think, and also the governor of Punjab. His name was Ahmad Nailti Jeen, I think. So he raided Banaras, and he was successful raiding Banaras, and he got a lot of booty from Banaras. And the third battle, I think, third major engagement between Muhammad Ghori particularly and the one Indian ruler who is not she is a queen whose name is Nike Devi. So she fought Mahmud Ghori, and the battle is called the Battle of Gadarar Ghatta. So this battle happened around 1173, around this period, and this battle happened around the Mount Abu region. So here we are told that the army of there are some fragments that are present in Prabandha Chintamani and other sources. So we are told that the army of Mahmud Ghori is not mentioned, but historians believe that since this was the period of Mahmud Ghori, he was most likely the ruler who was defeated by Queen Nike Devi. And so just wanted to add that.
Yeah, so like readers of pop fiction might be aware of a recent book published by the best-selling author in India, Amish Tripathi. So it's called something like The King Who Saved India. So it has a nationalistic tinge to it. It's about the legend of Suhel Dev. So that book sort of makes that point of some ruler who defeated the later, like the ruler after Ghazni, Mahmud of Ghazni, and how that followed 150 years of no one from the west conquering India. I don't know how historically tenable that is, but yeah.
Another important point about this is that we see that after this Suhel Dev, although no Indian sources talk about this defeat of Salar Masood Ghazi, we learn this from the Persian sources, and this invasion of Banaras also happened just after this Salar Masood Ghazi's ill-fated invasion. And the later Ghaznavids also did try to raid these Indian territories, and most of the time, since the kind of military genius Mahmud Ghazni had, they did not have that kind of capacity. So most of the time this was the main reason, one of the main reasons also why they failed. And there is some scholars also argue that from the reign of from the period of Mahmud Ghazni and to the period of Mahmud Ghori, the nature of the Turkish armies also changed. So earlier, during the reign of Mahmud Ghazni, most of these or the main component of the army was constituted by the Turkish slaves, and these were Central Asian nomads. And by the time of Mahmud Ghori, some scholars argue that the numbers of Afghans and Afghani tribes had increased, and there were also a significant component of infantry that was also included in the armies of Mahmud Ghori. So the nature of these two armies was also quite significantly different from the.
And one other thing we can say about this this series of invasions of the Ghauris started and the Sultanate that followed them, that the first two invasions, the invasion of Sindh and Mahmud Ghaznavi's invasions of India, included some knowledge transfer, right? Al-Biruni in the case of Ghaznavi, and in the case of the Sindh invasion, there were Arabs translated several Indian works and took some Indian physicians and people with them. But the Ghauris and the Delhi sultans who followed them seem to have been more sort of warlike and less interested in this side of things. I can't think of any, even the famous Amir Khusro. They're not really translating a lot of Indian stuff anymore. Only the next series of translations and knowledge transfer that happens is really under Akbar. Until then, there's sort of a black hole, or at least I don't know of much. Maybe Jay knows something.
No, I also don't know, Umar Saab, but I think one way which we can explain this is because Delhi became the refuge of most of these Central Asian people who, they were devastated by the Mongol raids. So most of the time, those who, refugees who came to Delhi, they had no interest in knowing the region, this region. So so because since only Delhi was secured from the Mongol menace, and the whole Persian upper intellectual or intelligentsia, most of these poets and other important personalities, since they migrated in Delhi, so they were busy in talking, glorifying what they had left from the Central Asia or Persia.
That's an interesting angle. Yes, I think that makes sense. That probably played a role.
Right.
Well, I think we have to end soon.
So I'll just take a few more minutes. This is very interesting conversation, and one of the things we've missed out, we normally do is, are there any philosophical, mathematical, scientific developments, advancements that are happening, or is the polity too much in a flux and there isn't anybody to really patronize this in this period? Any kind of legacy on that end, Jay, that we know of, non-Islamic? We'll come to the Islamic legacy later. Any philosophers, any mathematicians, any scientists whose work survives?
I think one person which we have missed, since we did not discuss the religious angle. I think Shankaracharya, who most scholars believe was from 8th century onwards.
Yeah, we've done a comprehensive. Sorry, I'll interrupt you there. We've comprehensively covered him in our episode South India from 500 to 1100 AD. So for listeners who would like to sort of know more about that, that's a very comprehensive coverage there. I was talking more about North India.
Mihir Bhoj was a great patron, and also I think Gauravji would, I have forgot, he wrote a text, I think, on mathematics or astronomy, if I'm not correct, or if I'm not wrong.
Right. Omar Saab, Gaurav, any thoughts on any philosophers or any non-political figure of this time whose legacy still survives?
I have no idea. The only people I know would be from the other side is, of course, Al-Biruni and his work. But on the Indian side, I don't know. I don't think on Al-Biruni's work, one thing I just remembered, one of the things he mentions when he's talking about the Indian mathematicians and people he's following, he's a great fan of some of their work, but some of their work he dismisses as being too religious and fanciful. But I wonder if, Jay, you have any idea about this, that some of these mathematical works would be written in metric, like poetry, and the references used or the terms used would be religious terms, but there was a kind of a mathematical meaning under it. An entire theorem could be presented in a poem form like that. Do you know anything about this and how this tradition was in India? And which may have been something that Al-Biruni, even though he tried to learn Sanskrit, had some difficulty translating or figuring out.
Yes, the poetry part is correct. I think Will Durant in his multi-volume book of the story of civilization talks about that. The Hindus had this habit of mentioning everything in poetry. So from poem to a treaty on religion is always on poetry. So I think this is an important aspect, although I don't and have any idea about particular aspect of any mathematical or astronomical.
So one thing Abhinav Gupta was one of the philosophers from Kashmir, a polymath personality. So he is from the 10th century, so on. So he is credited with some of the way Kashmiri Shaivism evolved. So also we talked about Bharat Muni's Natya Shastra. So Abhinav Bharati is a commentary on Bharat Muni's Natya Shastra written by Abhinav Gupta. And in 9th century, 10th century, I think we touched about Kumaril Bhatt and Shankara in the earlier episode with Mukunda and Shrikant. So a lot of like the darshanas, 6 darshanas of Indian Hindu philosophy, they were the Nyaya Darshana, Vaisheshik, like the schools of logic, they were still in flux during this time. And we also talked about a lot of works of mathematics during the Gupta era and during the time of Harsha. So some of them are like the dating of these works is a bit shaky in some cases. So in some cases they may also like maybe not the original works, but some of the consequent works could have been during this period as well, 7th, 8th, 9th century.
Right.
And just an interesting aside in Al-Biruni's book, when he's talking about the Indian astronomers and is admiring them, one of the things he criticizes, one of them, I forget which one it was, Brahmagupta or someone, that when he describes what an eclipse is, he said the Indians are very clear about the fact that this is a globe, that there are these planets, they're going around the sun, that the eclipse happens because the Earth casts a shadow on the moon or the moon casts a shadow on the Earth. All of this was well known to their astronomers. But at the same time, there was a religious or sort of mythical story around it also, right? The Rahu or whatever, the dragon eats the moon and then gives it back or whatever. And he was very unhappy, Al-Biruni is very unhappy that this great astronomer explained all of it in sort of scientific terms, but then could not resist adding that some people say that it's like this, and then gave the Rahu story also.
Right. So before we wrap up the episode, any thoughts our speakers have on the two battles that Prithviraj Chauhan and Muhammad Ghori fought? First of all, what is the geographical location in the present-day map of the subcontinent? Where are these battles fought?
Near Thanesar, right? Haryana.
Bhatinda.
Bhatinda, which is in Punjab.
Yes.
Thanesar,
It's
right.
contested, right? Yes, Bhatinda is the more popular thing, but some people have some other theories as well.
Right. The Indian army still has a very large cantonment in Bhatinda. So, for whatever it's worth.
It may, if you look at geographically, it made much more sense because since Gauri is coming from the north, and after the most the Hasi, which was the center of the Chauhanas, since he had to cross Satluj, so this made much more sense, to counter him in from around Bhatinda, because if the Chauhans allowed them to penetrate deeper, they could easily just deflect or just go sideways, because the Ghurid army was famous for its mobility. So in order to to stop them from moving or deflecting their attack, main attack, so the Chauhanas basically that is why they tried to pin him down in Tabarhind, in Bhatinda or Tarayan.
Right. So Umar Saab, some final thoughts on the legacy of this period, how it would go on to influence the next 700, 800 years of history of the subcontinent?
Well, I think we will leave that till the next episode, because obviously the biggest thing is that this was the creation or the foundation of the Delhi Sultanate, which is the foundation of Muslim rule in North India, right? As we mentioned, from the time of Ghaznavi's invasion, Lahore is already incorporated into the Ghaznavi Empire, and Sindh had been taken 300 years earlier by the Arabs. But that's it. That's the only portions of sort of Indian land that had been conquered until that point. But after the Delhi Sultanate, it's obviously within sort of mainland India, and that is going to have that conquest is playing out even till today. Everything that has happened since then has a lot to do with it, and Pakistan, creation of Pakistan, all this India Hindu Muslim thing. All these are gifts of that era, and how we interpret it or how we look at it varies from one extreme to the other, but I think we'll discuss it in detail when we get to the Delhi Sultanate.
Right. Then I'll ask you one last question. What is the state of the Sun Temple in Multan right now? Can you throw some light on what is it like? Can one visit it? What's its size and shape like?
No. I think it was demolished or whatever and converted into whatever is left there is they built some Sufi shrine on it or something. There is no temple as far as I know.
I think even that is not sure. Archaeologically,
yeah,
I don't think they have found it.
It's gone.
Yeah, so no idea.
No, what are we not sure of? Was there a temple there, or we?
No,
we are
there
not
was
sure what
definitely a
there was
temple.
definitely a temple. There's a lot of Indian sources, and there is the Arab source itself also mentioned that temple. So
Swansang
there
also,
was
talks about it.
there was a large sun temple there, and that was a center of sort of Surya worship, is very, very well established. But what happened to that temple and where did it go? I'm not sure. I'm actually Googling it right now as I talk to you because this is the age of Google. But where is it buried? I think even Google doesn't know. Yeah.
Sure. So we'll
Nobody
leave
knows
it
for
to
sure.
that. Thank you, the three of you.
Just one comment to add before. So anyone who is interested in sort of the like a fictionalized version of this era should read a fantastic book by S.L. Bhairappa called Sarth. So it captures this era around 7th, 8th century, and it does so extremely well. I think the historicity may be contested here and there, but it gives the feel of what the subcontinent was around the time we are talking about. And a lot more things remaining from this time, but maybe in the next one we can cover them.
One point which I wanted to make is that among in the historical circles, there is this great debate about compartmentalization of Indian history. So this was the period since Britishers wrote the first modern history of India. So this was the period, with the establishment of Delhi Sultanate, ancient history has, finished, has come to an end. This was the period when the medieval history of the Indian subcontinent starts. So this, although most present scholars don't like this term, that is why this early medieval period was used. So just wanted to add that.
Sure. As to Gaurav, your point as to we could have covered a lot more ground. Possibly we'll do that in the next episode, which we do on Delhi Sultanate. So ground that
we could,
out.
So like some of the cultural things, for example, Jainism, as we understand, especially in the North Indian part, that was patronized heavily during the Gurjar Pratihara period. So a lot of Jain temples we talked about. We didn't talk anything about that. Also, the way Hinduism changed. So maybe we'll cover that sometime.
Also, this was the period, when from the main subcontinent, Buddhism declined or disappeared. With this we can also talk about.
Sure. Then what we'll do is maybe we'll do an episode on the socio-cultural milieu. Do a small episode there.
Right. That would be nice.
Right. So I would like to remind our listeners that our speakers, as part of speakers notes, will share all the sources and reference materials that they've used as part of their commentary in this episode.
Tune in next week for Browncast.
Thank you, and we look forward to your company soon.
Thank you.